I'm not judging. They're the judges.
I'm glad.
Awesome.
Maybe.
I guess Chris would do this, I don't know.
Welcome to the 2016 ACC Debate Championship, and congratulations to both Miami and Wake Forest for making it to the final round. So we have team from University of Miami on the affirmative, team from Wake Forest University on the negative, and we will begin with the 1AC.
Thank you. Before we begin, Michael and I are honored to represent the Coastal Division in this final round. This tournament has been an absolutely wonderful experience, and we would like to sincerely thank Dave Brown and the Atlantic Coast Conference for their support of this event, and Chris and the University of North Carolina team for being great hosts, and this place is so beautiful. Also, as graduating seniors, this is our last debate. We would like to thank the University of Miami, the School of Communication, Debate, and our coaches and teammates, especially Dave Steinberg and Randall Martinez. With that being said, concealed carry is on the rise in college and university campuses across America. Liberalization of gun laws are occurring at an alarming level. In 2013, at least 19 states introduced legislation to allow concealed carry on campus, and in 2014, 14 states introduced similar legislation. Last year, Texas became the most recent state to allow concealed carry weapons on college campuses. It is for this reason that we stand resolved that the United States should adopt substantially more restrictive gun control regulations, including a prohibition on carrying firearms on college campuses. Now, college campuses are very unique places, right? They're places of learning and self-discovery. They're often the first time a student moves away from home. And so, for this reason, we are proudly standing for the fact that we need this prohibition of arms. First, for the propensity of violence that we see. Now, college campuses, unfortunately, dorms can be easily broken into, right? And laptops could be stolen, purses could be stolen. Now replace those words with the word gun, and you have an increased risk of theft of guns on campus. Also, campuses, because they're places of self-discovery, you might have students under the influence of drugs or alcohol, which could impair judgment. And we believe that this increases increases the chance of more fatal accidents. DePhillips and Hughes last year wrote that even among highly trained professionals, gun accidents occur with startling frequency. For instance, in the military from 2003 to 11, more than 90 soldiers died from negligent charges. This translated to an unintentional injury rate of 7.7 per 100,000 regular Army soldiers per year. So if accidental shootings happen that often among trained professionals whose job requires frequent handling of firearms, the average student or professor carrying a firearm would unlikely fare better. Also, gun arguments can easily turn lethal. We think that even arguments easily forgotten can easily escalate. A 2002 study by David Hemingway found that having a gun at college was associated with engaging in more risky and aggressive behavior, as well as drinking heavily, which itself is a major risk factor in firearm violence. A more recent study in 2015 determined that a significant number of firearm owners and those who carry firearms in public exhibit impulsive, angry behavior. Also, educational harms, right? So UT Austin, again, we heard Texas was the most recent state to favor campus carry. They've had professors leave, citing specifically the campus carry policy. They are in fear and at risk of losing their lives, and so we've seen them leave the school. We also see people not willing to enter the profession, right? So if all campuses are allowing campus carry, professors and academics might not be inclined to enter the teaching profession, which is damaging the educational environment. We also see self-censorship. With this fear of violent retaliation, faculty offices and classrooms have traditionally been places of open dialogue on academic research, even disciplinary matters. But now, with the rise of campus carry, people might shy away from sensitive topics. And we believe that the discussion of controversial issues is pivotal to the development of dialogue, and also in the future as we graduate, policy making, because we need to have these dialogues on campus in schools in order to learn from them in the real world. So we believe that this prohibition is the right thing to do, right? Reducing the number of guns on campuses. Freedom of thought has long reigned in universities. Are we willing to lose this? In addition, as a result of these laws, fewer students have had access to guns on campus, and campuses are safer learning environments. Less than 2% of college students report being threatened with a gun while at school with these bans on campuses. There were 11,920 total gun homicides in the U.S. in 2003, but only 10 total murders or non-negligent homicides on the nation's college campuses. So violent crime for college students has declined significantly as a result of these bans, and college students are less likely than non-students to be victims of crime. So at the point where we are decreasing the amount of guns on campus, you see a decrease in the amount of violence, and you are really fostering this open learning environment. You're avoiding any type of self-censorship. You get to discuss the controversial issues, which could also be pivotal in developing, in spurring social change in the United States. And of course, you don't trigger the brain drain. This is the right thing to do, reducing the access and number of guns on campus, and so we proudly propose. Thank you.
Okay, the plan text says you mandate a prohibition on carrying firearms on campus. What does that mean?
Oh, sorry. So it's banning all guns for students, faculty, administrators.
So ban all guns, there's no exemptions?
No.
No exemptions, okay. So that means that there's no guns on college campuses across the United States. Zero. Like police officers don't have guns?
So the idea is that the people there creates a safer environment for people not.
Right, so I just need a yes or answer to my
police
question.
officers aren't part of the learning environment, right? Okay.
Okay, so the students are the ones, people who aren't students.
Faculty,
Okay.
administrators.
Makes sense, cool. What example of negligent discharge led to a death or injury at Colorado or Utah? Or in those states when they legalized campus carry?
So not only was it just discharges, but discharges in regards to sexual assault. Sexual assaults raised by 50% in Colorado and Utah after those concealed carry.
Much like they did across the country though, correct?
And also in Texas on August 26th, a heated argument in a parking lot turned deadly when one of the individuals killed one person and wounded a bystander.
Okay, sure. Let's talk about the argument that people will get into fights or disagreements with guns. Obviously, the AF doesn't regulate off-campus guns, so what's stopping a student from having a gun at their off-campus location and then getting into an altercation with a student after school ends?
We believe this is a step in the right direction, right? And it actually contributes to a cultural change, right? To decrease gun violence on the whole. But this is where we have our solvency.
What study do you cite that says when we ban concealed carry or carrying firearms on campus, it means that students are less likely to own a gun, not just that they won't have it on campus?
Well, we see already in the status quo that the age to own a gun primarily is 21 years old. And so we believe most students don't have that. But this takes that a step further to ensure that they don't.
Right, but that not answered the question. That's fine.
Oh.
What study says that professors don't enter academia because of campus carry laws?
I mean, this is what's happening in Texas. We've seen UT Austin
So
professors.
you've seen a professor leave, not that they haven't entered academia. So is that argument just Miami and 16, or is there a study
No,
that
let me
supports it?
give you, first of all, you don't need evidence to show something, but more importantly, bringing from
This question
Justice
probably
Smart,
do.
which I'll talk about soon.
So, Jack and I, we are honored to represent the Atlantic Division in the finals of the ACC championship debate. There are a lot of people that we'd like to thank. First is we would like to thank the ACC, specifically Chris Lundberg and the UNC debate team for hosting. Next, we would like to thank the Wake Forest University Board of Trustees, specifically the Medica family. We would like to thank Dr. Loudon. We would like to thank all of our coaches, specifically Becca Steiner, and also Jared Atchison, Justin Green, and Ken Strange. We'd like to thank our teammates who have helped us at home, specifically Alex, Ned, and Kate. We'd also like to thank Len Neighbors because we're the negative. And lastly, I would like to thank my partner, Jack. This has been an awesome experience. So I will begin with the first negative speech. The order will be 2 off cases and then moving on to the affirmative case. The affirmative has said in cross-examination that there are no exemptions to the prohibition that they defend on campus carry, which means that they have to prohibit the possession, transport, and use of personally owned firearms by students on college campuses. This blanket prohibition, however, runs into a major problem. How could West Point adhere to this? According to a memorandum from Captain Joshua Klatsko, quote, individuals may possess, transport, and use personally owned firearms on West Point for marksmanship activities in authorized areas determined by West Point Range Control. The affirmative's proposal, as they have stated it, would render these marksmanship activities impossible on campus. Thus, we propose that the United States should adopt substantially more restrictive gun control regulations, including a prohibition on carrying firearms on college campuses and universities, excluding military academies. Former member of the U.S. Navy Museum's Board of Directors, Andre Delau, indicates that, quote, for over 200 years, the long gray line, graduates of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, has learned marksmanship as part of the skills needed to be effective officers and warriors. These marksmanship activities are fundamental not only to cadets, but also to cadet candidates at the West Point Preparatory School. The U.S. Military Academy's website states that during basic training for rifle marksmanship, cadet candidates, quote, will be trained to maintain and engage targets with their personally assigned weapon. This training provides invaluable expertise for future military officers. Without West Point's unique military training with the weapons that the affirmative bans, our Army will face a future filled with less experienced officers who are not as well trained, according to Don Gomez in 2015. Military academies are precious and valuable institutions that produce superior officers. Dismantling them would undermine the quality of officership in the military. I'll refer mostly to the United States Military Academy at West Point. They are invaluable to the work and mission of the United States Army. West Point officers are strict, intense, and deeply committed to mission success. Some of the best officers I've ever worked with were graduates of West Point. And although I've met West Point officers whom I personally didn't like, I've never met one that was wholly incompetent. Even the bad ones accomplished the mission. Being a student at West Point is more of a military experience than a college experience. If the logic holds true, then it should also hold true that those officers are receiving 4 additional years of military experience than the ROTC and OCS counterparts just don't get. They are immersed in a military environment. Everything that is supposed to be expected from an officer is ingrained. You just can't do the same thing with a college student sporadically attending ROTC courses. If the affirmative does not allow students to possess or use firearms on campus, how could this essential training possibly occur? This is the clearest example of how no policy can be treated as a one-size-fits-all solution. Each campus must make its own decision on guns. Our second counterproposal is that the United States should prohibit students from carrying firearms on public college and university campuses and substantially expand gun control regulations. However, private religious institutions that do not receive federal funds should be exempt from the prohibition. The net benefit is the slippery slope towards greater infringement on religious education, which is a precursor to religious freedom. Bob Jones and Liberty do not accept federal funds, so they are exempt from all other types of federal laws like Title VII hiring laws. The affirmative would be a major break in policy and would enable a whole new set of federal laws in the name of saving lives, like forcing a Christian school to pay for birth control. The slippery slope then leads to forced immunization and Christian scientists being forced to receive medicine in the name of public health. The affirmative undermines freedom of religion, according to John DePippa in 2015. Minnesota allowed private establishments to prohibit guns on their property. At the same time, it prohibited private establishments from banning guns in their parking lots. Places of worship had to post no gun notices to prevent possession inside the church. 2 churches challenged the law, claiming that it violated the federal First Amendment. The court found that the signage requirement burdened the religious beliefs of the churches by requiring them to parrot a state-mandated message. Additionally, you must prioritize this preservation of freedom above all else. As esteemed Wake Forest law professor Sylvester Petro once said, "It is seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once. Thus, it is unacceptable to say that the invasion of one aspect of freedom is of no import, because there have been invasions of so many other aspects. That road leads to chaos, tyranny, despotism, and the end of all human aspiration. Every invasion of freedom must be emphatically identified and resisted with undying spirit." Moving on to the affirmative case. Their first argument about theft is incorrect. Schools should prevent theft through actual security measures instead of stripping away the rights of law-abiding citizens, according to Gabrielle Russin. Police Chief Beery said campus carry would cost his department for officers to deal with calls. Beery outlined legally owned guns being stolen from dorms. Stube dismissed many of the school's concerns. If colleges don't feel like they have a security measure at their schools, that's something they should have addressed years ago. Law-abiding citizens should not have their rights stripped. The affirmative's next point about accidents ignores that gun-related accidents are at historic lows. According to the National Safety Council's 2013 report, the number of unintentional gun fatalities was 600 deaths in 2011 compared to 1,441 in 1991. Finally, on the affirmative's argument about academic freedom. First, this is an anecdote with no statistical evidence. Second is that other weapons would also lead to a loss of academic freedom, since angry students could bring out a knife inside or outside a classroom to threaten a teacher. And third, additionally, is that this brain drain argument is simply a lie, because there is still a vibrant academic environment at schools like the UT system, despite the existence of campus carry coming in August 1st. I now stand ready for cross-examination.
You say we should prioritize the preservation of freedom, but is this really an infringement on freedom?
Yes. We have read evidence from John DePippa in 2015 that indicates that religious institutions would see their freedom be violated were the United States to mandate that they prohibit campus carry.
Okay, I'm going to move on to another issue. Are all military members graduates of military academies?
Well, not all of them are, but the best are. And we need to ensure that the best are trained as properly as possible. Given that the affirmative would prohibit these cadets from engaging in the necessary marksmanship activities they need to complete their training, that the affirmative would substantially undermine the warfighting abilities of the United States.
U.S. Army, Navy, Marine Corps, do they not provide adequate marksmanship training?
They do now, but the affirmative would preclude that, given that the affirmative prevents the possession, transportation, and use of firearms by students on college campuses.
It's also not only about the training of the weapons themselves, it's the military culture of the institution. So Ardegoma's evidence makes a comparative claim that ROTCs and OCSs do not have the same sort of military environment for the 4 years that they are in college, which means when they become officers, they are less inclined to be the kind of officers that we need leading the troops in wars like in the Middle East, etc.
I agree.
Even if they have marksmanship training.
Okay, what kind of active security measures might schools take to prevent crime?
An example would be installing gun safes, right? Like cops could encourage students in their dorms to have the necessary locks to prevent theft.
You wouldn't, but so you still want to take guns out of all college campuses except for religiously affiliated and military academies?
Yes.
Okay, why do you want to do that?
Why? Because we have articulated net benefits to those proposals.
Okay, you really have articulated the net benefits of removing guns on college campuses.
Well, we agree with most of the affirmative except these 2 exceptions that we have carved out,
Okay,
which is why we solve the affirmative.
What is the responsibility of state governments in terms of protection of citizens?
The responsibility of state governments is actually to emphatically resist every invasion of freedom. That's our Petro argument.
Thank you.
All right, is everyone ready? Awesome, cool, sweet. We love debate, especially public debate, which is what this was meant for. Clearly, our opposition really enjoys policy, which is why they're giving us a counter example and a counter definition, which this is really bad for public debate. Why? They are not actually advocating for their stance. And technically, they're agreeing with us, right? We should ban guns on campus because they're bad, except for a couple exceptions. We think this is bad for debate for a couple of reasons, right? First of all, we tell you from a Perlman and Upshur-Tyka card, right? The universal audience is an imagined audience that serves as an ethical and argument test for rhetoric. The content addressed to universal audience must concede the listener that the reasons the audience are a compelling character. Secondly, we also have a definition from the Cambridge Dictionary that relating to or involving people in general rather than limiting to a particular group of people. All of you are awesome, exceptional policy probably judges, right? But the audience who's actually looking out there might be turned off and might turn this off right now because they refuse to debate the motion on their side. We feel like this is extremely abusive, not the rhetoric of a public debate, especially when they try to use evidence doesn't necessarily mean it's true, right? We could talk to you about logical explanations and our own anecdotal evidence which shows this is true, but this is going to be bad because it avoids argumentation and advocacy, which relies on the audience's specialized knowledge, such as you all, to think like they could probably run this type of an argumentation. And it's not understandable people who don't know debate, and it's wasted a minute and 20 seconds of my time when I can talk about the implications and the harm that's happening on college campuses, which let's even try to attack their case still, right? You talk about the military, right? But we bring you this card, and my partner stated from Hughes, that says that what occurred is that these individuals, the British Armed Forces from 2003-2007, found 1,150 unintentional firearm discharge, which 43 resulted in injury. This translates to an unintentional injury rate of 7.7 per $100,000 of regular soldiers, of Army soldiers each year. Imagine if this is actually allowed on a college campus. This would actually be worse, right? These poor military men who actually are men and women who are very stressed out of what they're trying to do. So what occurs, right? In addition to that, we believe that suicide is a very horrible issue in today's debate that needs to be addressed. I suffer from depression. It's a very hard thing to deal with, and as a man, I refuse to go and get treatment because of my pride. But what happens in a more stressful environment or a more extreme environment where you have military very stressful, a very extreme environment where religious tensions are running high, imagining that exemption to allow guns to be able to take out the minority voices who might not practice their religion in those environments, right? That's what their type of world allows for. And we think this is extremely harmful, especially when the military personnel sadly might be more likely to harm themselves or commit suicide because of their stress and trying to serve their country and the PTSD once they have to serve, or even before that, just thinking about that. This is horrible. As the card says from Ewing and Trance of 2016, 1 in 1,000 suicides occur on college campuses every year in the United States, and 1 in every 10 students has made a plan for killing themselves. The majority of suicide attempts in poisoning or overdose result in fatality of only 2% of the time. Firearm suicides, however, result in a fatality of 85% of the time. So when the campus carry debate overlooks the possible impact a gun accessibility could have on suicide rates on college campus, they want to exacerbate that and make it in the most extreme case scenarios with the most tensions are rising in a military institute where you're protecting or safeguarding our country, or in a religious institute where tensions are usually running very high because it's very, we need to make sure things are protected. We think this is extremely harmful and weighs to our side of the debate, excuse me. But more on the affirmative, right? We really feel like they've done a really good job of not answering our points, right? Because we talk about the idea of perpetuation of violence. They talk about the Second Amendment. Gee, cares? The Second Amendment doesn't talk about the location of where or where not people can hold their individual firearms, right? Because of this fact, 42 states, I guess in their world, are unconstitutional, or let's make some type of exemption due to some policy debate rule, right? We feel this is horrible and not the truth of this fact. The Second Amendment, sure, it allows for personal firearm in your own house and things of that nature, but it's up to these institutions, it's up to the state, it's up to the government to safeguard and protect the best interests of its people, which you feel like they're doing by ensuring that at least 42 of these states do not allow this campus carry because of the harms that it'll address, which I go into right now. So we talk about turning lethal, right? They really don't engage with this argumentation coming from Hemingway, which talks about the risk and aggressiveness. We've all probably had a drink when we were freshmen in college, right? We all probably got a little too antsy and maybe gotten hungover the next day, right? This, coupled with a gun in your possession, allows that to increase more likely, and also what happened in northern Arizona, where 2 frat boys, they're in this whole thing, and then they actually ended up shooting the other. We think this is more likely to occur in a world that they possess, especially maybe in a religious or academic. But more importantly, education. We can turn this whole exception on them, right? These extremities don't allow for safe spaces, especially minorities who might be atheists in a religious institution who just go there because it's awesome, for example, like Boston College, right? Or even Liberty. But we feel like this is horrible, and they allow learning not to increase. They allow more fear of the teachers who want to leave.
Okay. So my first question is about your claim that evidence is not necessary to prove something true. You have argued that we have to account for intellectual discussions within academic spaces. If I turned in a paper to one of my professors with no citations, do you think that I would get an A?
This has nothing to do with that. You've tried to use policy debate jargon to completely
Well, no,
twist
I'm
this
asking-
and not debate the side that you're supposed to, which is advocating for people to have guns on a
I'm asking about a particular point
campus.
you've made that says that evidence should not be expected in a debate. If
Because
I turned in
you-
a paper with no citations, would I
Sure.
get
It
an
shouldn't be
A?
relied upon.
It shouldn't be relied
In
upon.
public debate, we can use anecdotal evidence. We can use studies, which we've brought you both today. To
Okay.
say that we need to discount our anecdotal evidence is damaging to the dialogue.
Okay, so our next question is, why would a counterproposal about the United States military and private religious institutions turn off an audience in a public debate?
Because this is not what we're discussing, right? We're discussing how is it that we have to do the affirmative, but you can as well. The people want to say, like, okay,
Well,
what are
we
the
don't do
benefits
the
of?
affirmative because we have an
Excuse me. The people out there want to say, like, okay, what are the benefits of having a gun on campus, right? You never really talk about that. You just try to circumvent the wheel and bring up these extreme examples of military personnel and religious, which they kind of really tensions can rise higher, and military personnel are probably more likely to commit suicide because of these tensions and the fact that they have to worry about safeguarding their country, and it's a very stressful time, and these will increase when you have a gun ability to kill yourself.
Okay, so I'd like to ask about an argument you've made on the affirmative case
Go
that
for it, man.
we prevent 42 states from making their own decision on campus carry.
No, I talked about the constitutionality aspect of that it's unconstitutional and 42 states are unconstitutional. But because the amendment doesn't talk about the location, they are free to actually do this on their own.
Wait, why does the amendment have to talk about location, right? Like the
It
Constitution.
doesn't, that's the point.
Says that the Constitution applies to all states.
Sure, but we're talking about campus carry. Nowhere does a Second Amendment is the Second Amendment protected? Is campus carry protected under the Second Amendment?
Well,
That's what
we
we're
talked
talking
about.
about.
The First Amendment, not the Second Amendment, but that is all right.
Sure, the First Amendment's even worse because in an educational space, they're not going to have the ability to talk because they're deterred by these guns pointed in their faces. Sorry, let me get this pen up here. Thanks, man.
So the order will be the first minute and 20 of the 2AC and then the pick, the military academy pick. Counter proposal number 1. Adam will take counter proposal number 2. Talk about the case. Is anybody not ready? Oh. Our opponents are right. We love policy debate. We do it. But if you think that what that 1NC was policy debate, you don't know what policy debate is. Because what we did was certainly the thing that we should do in public debates, especially over the question of gun regulations. The central question of this resolution was whether or not there should be a prohibition on carrying a firearm on a campus or university. The affirmative's foundational claim after the cross-ex of the 1AC was that there are no exemptions for campus carry and that there should never be a gun on a college campus. That thesis claim of the affirmative was engaged in by the 1NC. Arguing that there are exemptions that should exist is what engagement is. Public debates are about testing the nuances of the resolution. The great thing about the ACC debate tournament is that it provides us a forum through which we can discuss the various nuances of the gun debate, where we can engage in questions of what exemptions should and should not exist. They are making a lot of arguments about what it means for an audience to hear our proposal. I don't think anything in the 1NC was something that would turn an audience off. We've made arguments about why exemptions that the AF forecloses are good ideas. We have made disadvantages to the proposal that they have introduced. The argument that the 1NC was filled with jargon is also incorrect. The average person knows what a counterproposal is. They know what an exemption is. That's all the 1NC was. The argument that we use abusive rhetoric based on the jargon of policy debate is just not simply what the 1NC was. Now, they've made an argument about why evidence is not necessary. That could be true. Anecdotal evidence is certainly valuable. But given that we have introduced evidence that is contrary to the assertions of an affirmative, they have to demonstrate why that anecdotal evidence supersedes or answers the warrants of our evidence. Additionally, the argument that he had to waste a minute and 20 of his 2AC to answer what he thinks is policy debate jargon, well, I just spent 2 minutes answering it. Call that a positive time trade-off for them. But if we win any of these arguments, if we demonstrate that the question of this resolution is to discuss the nuances of gun policy, then we have won this debate, because the 2AC is insufficient in answering the reasons why exemptions are good, which is why I'm going to go to the military counterproposal now. It solves the affirmative. There are no affirmative arguments present in both the 1AC and the 2AC that argue as to why there is an advantage to the AF that holds true on military academies. If we win any risk of a net benefit, you should vote negative. Given the 2AC has not answered the net benefit to the counterproposal, you have to vote negative. They have conceded the argument that military academies necessitate gun possession, transport, and use in order to train future soldiers who will engage in combat. West Point operates under a military culture that requires future officers to train with firearms in order to understand what it will be like to go out into the battlefield. The negatives arguments about the stress of a military academy is precisely our argument. They have cited statistics about negligent discharges when they are on the battlefield. That study from the British Institute is about when soldiers are in the field and their gun went off. Our argument is that happens because of insufficient training at places like West Point, which is why when you remove guns from those places, those discharges become more likely. Additionally, the argument about stress is actually a negative argument. Think about it. All of the people who are training at West Point are going to go into war. At least some of them will. Those infantry men and women are going to face more stress on the battlefield than they do at West Point. Understanding that stress and dealing with it at West Point is superior to them dealing with it on the battlefield, because when they're being attacked, it won't help to ban their weapons from West Point, because that stress you thought you saved them from is just being replicated abroad. Now, the one real solvency deficit to the counterproposal, the argument that they have made about why we cannot solve their advantages, that was explained in the 2AC is the suicide rate. Now, while it is true that suicide is a terrible problem facing a litany of institutions in the status quo, that unfortunately is not what is occurring on military academies. Pam Zubrick did an analysis in 2005 about the relative rate of suicides on military academies. They said suicide attempts by cadets has prompted Air Force Academy officials to beef up programs to identify those risks. 7 cadets tried to kill themselves. In contrast, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point reported no suicide attempts in the last 2 years. Last year's suicide attempts at the Air Force Academy have motivated the Academy to review its prevention and counseling programs. The Academy is trying to teach cadets how to spot suicidal behavior. Now, in the next negative speech, Adam will make some more arguments about why suicide is a problem that the affirmative does not resolve either. But given that they have not introduced evidence about the likelihood of suicide on a military academy, you should be skeptical to their assertion that we should apply the studies of the 1AC to the counterproposal.
All right, ready?
Yes.
You said pick before you started. What is that?
It's a counterproposal.
Isn't that like a term used in policy debate?
Well, yeah, I'm a policy debater. I sometimes use some jargon that's inaccessible, which is why I changed it to say counterproposal, because that's what it actually
Isn't
is.
the point of a floating pick to then go away from it later on, so then you can just use that to waste another person's time, so then you can go into another argument?
Well, actually, that's a floating pick is something in K-debate that's different than what we've said as a counterproposal. But that nuance, that is an irrelevant argument to what is occurring in this debate right now.
Cool.
Because we could be having a debate about these exemptions and not policy debate jargon like you're critiquing us for doing if we just talked about that now instead of this in cross-X.
Sure, so let's talk about some of your points. You brought up this interesting argument about like the cadets are trying to help solve like suicide rates and like mental health. Wouldn't that won't the access to guns like increase the fact that they might actually kill themselves more if they're actually able to be on campus?
Well, so
they're currently not on campus now, correct?
No, they are. Like they're training with weapons now. Like they can't have personal weapons, but they have training weapons, which is what the AF bans, right? So the argument is, one, that those training weapons wouldn't be used for suicide. 2, is that when they go off to the battlefield, they face the same stress as they would at West Point, only magnified 100 times, which is why they need to deal with that stress now.
Why not increase the stress by taking away the guns currently on campus? They can still go off campus and off sites and still practice and train, correct? What's the benefit of having it on campus?
Well, so there's 2 arguments. The first is, I don't know what you mean by they could just go off campus and train. Like, that's not how the military works.
Currently. Why? What's the benefit
No,
of
they
having it on
don't. We've
campus
read evidence that they do.
lives?
No, they train on campus. That's just factually incorrect.
I'm asking you a question. What's the benefit of having it on campus if we
Right,
can reduce
so-
suicides and they can just they can just practice.
The two
on
arguments, right? The first one was that that's how they do it now. The second argument is that having it on campus creates the military culture argument described by De Gomez from the 1NC. And that is that the military culture of training and operating together as a unit like you will on the battlefield creates a more solidified connection between fellow infantrymen and women, which means when they become officers, they better understand how to interact in a military-to-military
In regards
context,
to the
which is superior.
education, how do you solve self-censorship when a gun can deter someone's free speech?
That doesn't happen at West Point now because they're training with the weapons, not shooting them at their fellow infantrymen and women.
We'll just take a look at it.
Yeah, sure. But that's a good thing. Okay.
Yeah.
10 seconds?
Yep. You got 450 remaining.
So, I'll be giving the first negative rebuttal. I will begin on our second counter proposal and then move on to the affirmative case. Is anybody not ready? The affirmative team has failed to contest our second counter proposal. At no point in their second affirmative constructive have they properly addressed the net benefit that we have established. Our evidence from the 1NC indicates that the affirmative's blanket prohibition on campus carry on all college campuses would undermine freedom of religion. Our evidence indicates that religious institutions would see their fundamental liberties violated because they would be forced to parrot a state-mandated interest. We would argue that it's up to religious institutions to decide for themselves, based upon the roots of their faith, whether they would truly like to prohibit campus carry. This counterproposal is enough to resolve all of the benefits of the affirmative while preserving our net benefit of preserving religious freedom, which is a fundamental right. This question of freedom is an interest. They say that the state has to protect the interests of citizens, but religious liberty is one of those fundamental interests. And as esteemed Wake Forest law professor Sylvester Petro once said, every violation of freedom must be emphatically identified and resisted with undying spirit. This must be a prior question to the affirmative's utilitarian calculus of deaths, given that what is the value of life without freedom? People die for our rights, which is a reason why we need to prioritize these fundamental questions of religious liberty. Lastly, is they argue that there are certain extremities that may exist on campus, but they argued that people are going to murder atheists at religious campuses. This is absolutely absurd. Religions are fundamentally peaceful, and most people at schools like Liberty or Bob Jones are not going around murdering atheists or creating unsafe environments. Also, most people at these schools are religious, so that would be a moot point anyways, but our counterproposal is sufficient to resolve the affirmative's harms. Moving on to the affirmative case. First, I would briefly like to talk about their claim that this is a public debate. Yes, we agree, and we have fully engaged in the style of public debate. Our representation in this final round is proof that all of the representatives here today of the Atlantic Coast Conference want us to represent the Atlantic Division faithfully in this final round, which is proof that we have not been engaging in mere policy debate. We have debated about policies, but not engaged in all of this jargon and all of these technicalities that they've claimed. Also, they say that we should not be reliant on evidence. We haven't relied on evidence. In fact, I have not read a single piece of evidence in my speech so far. But in fact, it is absurd for them to suggest that we should not prioritize evidence. As I had mentioned in cross-examination, if I turned in a paper to my professor with no citations, I would not get an A, which means that we clearly need statistics, we need evidence. Moving on to the affirmative's argument about suicides. The risk of gun-related accidents or suicides is extremely low following campus carry. According to Allison Paragori in 2015, some foresee a never-ending cavalcade of assaults, accidents, suicides, and threats. However, based on all available evidence, those predictions are wrong. More than 150 U.S. college campuses allow campus carry. Not one of those colleges has seen a single resulting assault, suicide attempt, or fatal accident. There isn't a single report of campus carry leading to even a weapon being brandished in anger. Opponents predict an increase in student suicides, ignoring the fact that 90% of suicides occur in the victim's home. Additionally, they did not bring up either of their arguments about theft or accidents in their second constructive, which is a reason why they should not revive those arguments later in the debate, as what we've discussed in our negative speeches is predicated on what the second affirmative constructive has argued. Their Hemingway evidence is survey data, but survey data is innately unreliable because you're asking students to report about their own behavior. What they may understand to be not aggressive may be understood by Hemingway to be aggressive, and Hemingway could not possibly account for all of the contingencies, which they ignore. Lastly, on their question of academic freedom and extremities, they have failed to contest that other weapons would cause this problem. If I brandish a knife at another student or a professor, it's also going to create some kind of an unsafe space or undermine the vibrancy of academic communities. Additionally, they mentioned that there were 2 fraternity boys who had had an accidental gunfight. Off-campus parties would also lead to that mix of alcohol and other forms of violence, which means that the affirmative is unable to resolve these issues. Lastly, is the affirmative claims again that the state has to protect people's interests, but we have shown that the negative side best does this because freedom should be the ultimate priority. Thank you.
Thanks to Ricardo and Georgia Tech, a foundation of policy, thanks to Ricardo and Georgia Tech, we are streaming live to a potentially huge audience who could benefit from being part of our discourse. And we benefit from increased exposure, publicity, and support. But if someone finds the stream and finds the language and style off-putting or not understandable, they are likely to leave. We also believe that the burden of rejoinder, a foundation of policy debate, is a counterproductive concept for the public debate. We heard them say, oh, they dropped their arguments about theft and something else. This is the burden of rejoinder, and again, it's counterproductive. This is the idea that failure to answer an argument means the other side wins. It is this convention which has created a world where it is valuable to speak or read really fast and make more arguments so that you deaden your opponents and hope that they will fail to answer them. And magic words and jargon are meaningless to a universal or public audience. At the point where they've read scholarly evidence in every speech and are relying at the point where they're actually running 2 counter proposals, we encourage you to favor the side that does a better job persuading an imaginary audience of smart, attentive people who are not familiar with the customs, language, and conventions of policy debate. If they violate these standards for public debate, we feel that it is reason alone to favor us in the debate. If the universal audience would turn off the stream or be excluded due to language or technique, Miami should win. But let's move on. First, what religion advocates shooting people, right? And isn't this not just a slippery slope argument, very consistent with the mechanisms of argument and policy debate? And if you don't buy that, they're saying we should favor freedom at all costs. Who is there to keep free if we are all dying in mass numbers, as the gun epidemic has proved? They say that the affirmative is utilitarian, that we're only going on the number of lives we save, but we also believe that there can be multiple weighing mechanisms in around, and that quality of life is also important, and that your quality of life diminishes when there is a gun in your classroom as a student, when you were threatened with a gun as a professor in a college. And so our evidence about UT Austin and other schools in Texas in which professors are leaving, that remains because it is hurting the quality of education, and it is actually leading to self-censorship among professors and students. On the military argument, I think this is really interesting. I mean, here I am stuck debating this nuanced exemption, but I'd like to engage. I think they neglect to address the stigma around mental health. They say that West Point didn't report a lot of suicides, but that probably has a lot to do with the culture being both patriarchal and military driven at West Point, right? And the idea is that at an early age, boys are taught to channel their sadness into anger because they are shamed over feeling sadness. This is research out of New York University. So before the ages of 15, 16, boys are actually more expressive than girls, even crying more. But when you allow guns to be present at these military academies, which are majority male students, we've seen that college-age men outpace women 4-to-1 in college suicides rates. We don't buy that the reporting at military academies is correct in saying there have been 0 suicides reported. This does not reflect the suicide statistics that real mental health professionals are putting out. It is a way of West Point Military Academy to say, hey men, come here, we'll give you guns, make you cool, and you won't cry ever again, right? We believe this is just wrong, which is why they shouldn't be part of the exemption anyway. So what are we left with in the end? We've given you the fact that we need to weigh this round on multiple weighing mechanisms. What is best for public debate, what is best for the safety of college students, and also which gives them the highest quality of life. At the point where we don't see religious freedoms actually infringed by this resolution, at the point where suicides are also happening on military campuses and we prevent that in our side of the debate, we proudly propose and urge a vote for the affirmative. Thank you.
So we have 4 minutes and 50 seconds remaining. It'll be the top of the 1AR and then the first counter proposal and then the second counter proposal. Is anybody not ready? A public debate about public debates. Seems like an appropriate way for us to end the ACC tournament. While the 1AR is very persuasive at arguing for why policy debate as an activity is ill fit for the public setting, what the 1AR was unfortunately lacking was an explanation of why what we did in this debate was an example of the policy debate jargon that they think is inappropriate to convince a imaginary audience that they should vote negative. The resolution asks us to debate regulations around guns, specifically campus carry laws. The most thorough and in-depth articles in the literature stress how complicated of an issue this is. Polarization often leads to shallow discussions that oversimplify key components of the gun debate, which is why literature often says we need to have specific discussions of the regulations that any gun policy entails. Our argument from the 2NC onward has been that the AF's foundational claim was that no exemption should exist for any university and that no gun should be given to faculty or students. That claim has been adamantly contested by the counterproposal, and I am failed to be convinced by the 1AR's argument that a imaginary audience wouldn't understand that. Ask yourself why the 1AR is correct that a universal audience would be unable to understand the arguments we are making. They have not explained to you why that is true. They've just asserted that we did something unappealing, which, granted, I might not sound pretty all the time, but I don't think any of the arguments we made is actually that unaccessible. Heck, my parents have watched me debate at this tournament for the first time, and they actually understood what I was saying. They weren't hearing me talking fast up in the room like I normally do, like they think we justify. None of that is what happened in this debate. Instead, we made a logical argument that the AF's blanket non-exemption policy was a bad idea. The job of the negative is to disprove the affirmative. We have done that. The burden of rejoinder arguments are not a way in which you should make your decision. It is not just about winning a singular argument, but it is winning the compilation of arguments. If, by the end of the debate, we are winning a reason why the affirmative is incorrect in their blanket exemption policy, you vote negative. Now, I will talk about the military counterproposal. They have not answered the internal net benefit. It is necessary for us to have a military that is trained with the weapons they will be going to war with. That creates better officers, creates better individuals who are able to then go out into the field and engage in the policies that the military academy needs them to. Again, this argument is not something that is inaccessible to any imaginary audience because they would understand that this exemption is something the affirmative precludes. The argument about stigma and suicide rates, while again is terrible and a deplorable policy, is not something the affirmative deals with either. The stigmatization of culture, the repression of suicide rates is not something that the affirmative can change from a societal basis. You have to ask yourself what it means for an individual to agree to become a cadet, to agree to go to West Point Academy. They have said that at some point they would like to serve their country. What they then have to do is confront the stresses that will be accompanied with that decision. When they go off into the battlefield, the internalized stress and sadness discussed by the 1AR is something that, unfortunately, because of the nature of warfare, they don't have the luxury of dealing with. The question you should ask yourself then is why we should put them into that situation cold turkey without any training on the issues that they will be dealing with on the battlefield. The statistics arguments are a reason you should err negative. West Point may not have disclosed everything in a way that is beneficial for the affirmative, i.e. the affirmative can be correct that they have underreported these arguments, but 150 college campuses have campus carry, and not one has reported a suicide from a gun, which is appropriate evidence from the 1NR. This demonstrates that there is no solvency deficit to our counterproposal, meaning that there is no reason that we cannot resolve the harms discussed in the 1AC, which is a reason to err affirmative, a negative rather. Now, the religious exemption pick was very well debated by the 1AR. The counterproposal does not seem like it has validity given that they have contested the slippery slope game. We agree there is no slippery slope between the religious exemptions and the AF, which is a reason they are correct about that argument. They are incorrect, however, about the counterproposal to not allow the military to engage in these actions, which is why you can still vote negative.
I'll take some.
Yeah, I muted. I got rid of that chat after semis.
Ready? Cool. Thank you so much for coming to this debate and judging this. I'm very sorry for what's occurred thus far. It really hasn't been much of a public debate. As they exemplified, they ran two counterclaims, which in policy debaters call two counterplans, right? They could have easily coupled this together and talk about we're giving an exemption for both military and religion. Interesting. But what they did, I asked them what a pick was, because what they did is exactly what a floating pick is. They made us waste time talking about religion when they're like, sure, you're right about religion. Let's talk about the military. This is completely abusive. This goes against the entire framework of what this type of debate was, to talk about a public discourse so everyone in the audience can listen to. Secondly, they also talk about this fact that, oh, they dropped something in like a 2AC, whatever that means, another policy jargon, and that means they can't bring it up later. False. That's another policy jargon. They try to take it to the policy debate. A public discussion means that if it comes up later, we can probably have this discussion, which we will in a couple of seconds. But more importantly, we believe that they also talk about this burden of rejoinder, right, which is this policy idea. Because they're trying to talk about this policy style of debate, they should lose on the basis of this entirely. Now the poor people probably commenting back and forth like, what is this 1AR? What is this policy stuff? We want to learn about the issues. Sure, let me talk about the issues then for you, right? So let's talk about the military. First of all, the military is awesome. The United States military is the strongest in the world. They have training. They don't even necessarily need to be on campus, right? Especially when they can still have these gun simulators, like they can still have like video games where they can play this stuff, and then it can also happen off campus. So the simulations of the training is still going on. They're just doing they're just doing status quo type argumentation, which is what's currently happening within the status quo, right? At least in ours, this is what's happening on the suicide type of debate, right? There's currently a culture of a lack of accountability in these military classrooms. We can use our own evidence against them that they're not even showing that these people are committing suicides. What happens on our side? What happens on our side is it's a cultural change, because we actually take a stand by decreasing the amount of guns, decreasing the amount of opportunities that someone who can snap, someone who's like premeditated this, has an 85% fatality rate of actually killing themselves with a firearm, which is very different than any other thing. This is something that's really gone uncontested, and in a public debate, it's really important for all the parents out there who have their kids in a military school. They want their kids safe, and so do we. We have safer regulations to protect them. They can still train off-site, right? It's not going to harm their capabilities to fight off ISIS, to fight off all these other things. Like, we believe the United States is still the best in the world, even though they still don't have guns on their campuses, but they want you to not believe that. We think is horrible. But more importantly, quickly on religion, even though they dropped that, I don't know about you, I'm a religious individual. We don't necessarily religion equate that with guns, right? We don't need guns to like protect our religion. We believe in God because we believe in God. Not necessarily a gun's going to protect us from other that. So that's really a non-issue, like they said in their policy type of jargon of debate. But more importantly, what world do we give you? Let's give you somewhat of a comparative, right? Because people like to think about what world would you rather live in? A world created by the affirmative or a world created by the negative? In a world created by the affirmative, we understand that there is a propensity of violence, right? Which we talk about in our Hughes card, which talks about even people who are highly trained, like the military, 7.7% of them out of 7.7 per 100,000 people actually harm themselves. This is a horrible situation to talk about. These things actually turn lethal, not just in a frat house, which is more accessible in a world where currently is at place, but at least we're able to minimize those risks. We're minimizing opportunities for people to harm themselves. We're actually creating a safer space, which is important in self-censorship. They talk about their whole thing of freedom, right? That's a net benefit. What's freedom? What's the freedom aspect of self-censoring someone's free speech because a gun's in the room and deterring their opportunity to speak their mind, to raise their hand in the class, and to speak their opinion? We think that happens more on our side because we create this foster of learning where teachers are no longer scared of a student maybe coming in there and disagreeing with them on a grade and maybe shooting them up, which has happened in Purdue, which has happened in Northern Virginia College. We think that happens more on our side. But listen to this. The world that they give you is a world where it's a status quo, right? We're allowing accountability for the military that doesn't care about suicide because of the patriarchy, and we allow a better world for all, a safer environment, and we are very proud to win this debate. Thank you.
Good job. Very good debate.